Hello there, everyone, and welcome to the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at the Word on Fire Institute. I'm John Allen. I am the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news source, and a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find Crux at www.cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. And of course, you can find the Word on Fire Institute, simplicity itself, wordonfire.institute. However you're coming to us, whether you were watching this in video format at home or listening in audio format in your car on the way to work or anything in between, we are glad to have you with us. I am coming to you, as always, from Rome, or I should say, as usual. I'm occasionally on the road, but mostly I'm in the Eternal City. And of course, here, like everywhere else, it is the holiday season. Now, the difference is that in most parts of the world, the holidays typically mean things slow down a little bit. In the Vatican, the holidays have the opposite effect. Things speed up, and that is for two reasons. At any given time, the Vatican has a slew of projects in the pipeline, documents getting ready for publication, decisions that have to be made, appointments that need to be announced, and so on. And when the clock starts ticking towards the end of the year, the pressure builds to get those things out of the system. So typically, there's a slew of them as we get closer and closer to the end of the year. The other is that the holidays are sort of prime time in the Vatican. The Pope is on the stage a lot. There is, of course, those peak moments, the liturgies, the midnight mass on Christmas Eve, New Year's Day, and so forth. But there are also lots of other things that happen in and around the holidays. Towards the end of the year, for instance, the Pope will give his year-end address to the Roman Curia. That's the central administrative bureaucracy here in the Vatican. Early in the new year, he will give his address to the diplomatic corps accredited to the Holy See, which is typically considered his most important foreign policy speech of the year. So lots going on, lots to talk about. This week on the show, as we do always, I am going to give you some headlines and then some context. So three major headlines from the last week have stood out. One, on Tuesday of this week, Pope Francis announced some important revisions to canon law. That's the code of law, the body of law that governs the Catholic Church, with regard to clerical sexual abuse. In two separate rescripts, those are legal documents that amend the law, the Pope essentially abolished the so-called pontifical secret for cases involving clerical sexual abuse. That's the highest degree of secrecy in church law, a violation of which traditionally could trigger excommunication. And he also modified the so-called secret of the office. That's the kind of routine degree of confidentiality that typically applies to business in the various departments of the Vatican, in order, basically, to facilitate cooperation with police, prosecutors, the criminal justice system, when it comes to clerical sexual abuse. This was described by one Vatican official as a kind of transition from an attitude of defensiveness and diffidence with regard to the civil justice system, secular justice systems embedded in church law, to one of trust and healthy collaboration. We will see how it plays out in practice, but certainly it is a major move, one that largely has been welcomed by survivors of clerical abuse and their advocates. In another move, Pope Francis also raised the age limit for what constitutes child pornography. The possession of child pornography is already a crime under church law. But heretofore, in order to count as child pornography, the images had to be of someone 14 years or younger. Pope Francis has now raised that to 18 to be in line with the law of the land in most parts of at least the Western world. Important milestones in the fight against clerical sexual abuse. But as always, passing a law, however difficult it may be, is in many ways the easy part. The hard part is applying that law in practice, and only time will tell how much success the Vatican has on that front. On another front, a controversy opened during the past week regarding Pence. or in Italian, Obolo di San Pietro. This is a collection that is taken up every year all around the Catholic world. Mass goers in the United States who have been to church on Sundays when the basket is being passed will understand what this is about. In a report in the Wall Street Journal, a colleague of mine, Frank Roca, based upon conversations with people who administer Peter's Pence here in the Vatican, reported that only about 10% of the income collected every year, and of course it runs into the millions of dollars, only about 10% of that actually goes to works of charity. The rest of it goes not only to administrative upkeep, but also just to routine Vatican expenses. Now, this report, of course, piggybacks on a scandal that has been unfolding in the Vatican in recent weeks, involving the $220 or so million purchase of a piece of property in London, a former Harrods warehouse slated to become luxury apartments, that was purchased by the Vatican Secretary of State, drawing upon those funds from Peter's Pence. The end result is that many people have been outraged at what they think is a kind of shell game going on here. That is, that a collection that is often marketed as a way to support the Pope's charitable works is actually going to other things. The Vatican has struggled to put out that fire. We will talk more about that in a bit. Finally, two of the major news stories of the last couple of weeks on the global stage outside the Catholic Church have been Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager, and her Fridays for the Future campaign against climate change, being named Times Person of the Year, and in the UK, the landslide election victory of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, which has put an exclamation point on Brexit, made it inevitable that the UK will be leaving the European Union. What is interesting is the Vatican had a great deal to say about Greta, not so much about Boris. And that, I think, reveals something about the long-term political strategy of Pope Francis and his team. All right, those are the headlines. As always, I would invite you to stick around for the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
So, context. Let us begin with the revisions to church law announced by Pope Francis on Tuesday of this week. In some ways, these steps were a long time in the making. Last February, Pope Francis convened a major summit of presidents of bishops' conferences from all around the world to discuss where the church stands and where it needs to go on the fight against clerical sexual abuse. And one theme that repeatedly surfaced in that meeting was the need for a robust policy of full collaboration with police, district attorneys, prosecutors, magistrates, in making sure that priests who would sexually abuse a minor face the full range of consequences, both under the civil and criminal law and also under ecclesiastical law. Of course, when a priest is accused of sexual abuse, if it turns out that that charge has merit, there are three things that can happen. One, he can face a criminal process in the state that he lives in that could lead to going to jail. Two, the diocese or religious order he is part of could face a civil lawsuit that leads to paying a settlement to the survivor. And three, there will be an ecclesiastical trial, which could lead to that priest being laicized, meaning formally expelled from the priesthood. Now, the problem in the past has sometimes been that the church will accumulate evidence as part of its own internal procedures, but because of secrecy requirements, has sometimes felt impeded, church officials have felt impeded, from sharing that information for the other two procedures, that is, the criminal and civil procedures. These revisions to church law are intended to make sure that that no longer happens. Certainly that was called for at that February summit, and it has also been a longstanding complaint of survivors and abuse victims and the organizations that advocate on their behalf. Now, of course, it remains to be seen what these amendments to the secrecy requirements mean operationally, because to be quite honest, it is very rare that a prosecutor would want information on a specific case directly from the Vatican. Much more often, they want information from the local diocese or the religious order to which the priest or cleric belongs. And so the test of these revisions will be how forthcoming at the local level, the retail level, you might say, the church becomes. Certainly in the United States, this won't mean a great deal operationally, because the U.S. bishops have already, really since the 2002 Dallas Charter, in the main, established a policy of full cooperation with criminal and civil justice, and have already reinterpreted the requirements of pontifical secrecy to permit that. But in other parts of the world, of course, this could mean a great deal. The other main change, of course, is the change regarding the age of what constitutes child pornography. Heretofore, it had meant images used for sexual gratification of whatever kind of a person 14 years or younger. Now it means that for a person 18 years or younger. Again, not an earthquake in the United States, because that has already been the guidelines under which the U.S. bishops were operating. But again, in other parts of the world, could have important consequences. Now, the real issue, however, is this when it comes to the clerical sexual abuse scandals. While the church is in different places, in different parts of the globe, in the United States, and for that matter, in most parts of the Western world, the reform measures that are embodied in these changes to church law are already accomplished fact. What frustrates survivors, victims, and for that matter, just rank-and-file Catholics, really, is that while the church has established very strong accountability measures for the crime of clerical sexual abuse, that is, today, everyone knows that if a priest is credibly accused of sexually abusing a minor, that priest is going to be immediately suspended from ministry. He is going to be reported to the police, and if it's within the statute of limitations, will face criminal accountability. There will undoubtedly be a civil lawsuit that will lead to a payout, and he will also face internal ecclesiastical discipline that almost certainly will lead to laicization, that is, expulsion from the priesthood. What the church has not yet quite established, however, is a companion system of strong accountability, not for the crime, but for the cover-up. That is, for willfully mishandling a charge of sexual abuse, or even if with no ill intent, simply failing to respond in the way that the law now requires. Now, certainly church law today recognizes the cover-up as a crime, and in fact, these revisions to church law regarding pontifical secrecy lift pontifical secrecy not merely for cases involving the crime of abuse, but also for the cover-up of that crime. So it is certainly theoretically possible that a bishop or other church official could be prosecuted for the cover-up, but we have not yet seen that in action. That is probably the next frontier of the reform effort. And speaking of that, sometime in early 2020, the Vatican is expected to release its long-awaited report on the contents of its archives, meaning who knew what when, in regard to the case of former cardinal and now former priest Theodore McCarrick of the United States. Now, if certain officials are identified in that report as having been aware, at least of reports of misconduct by former Cardinal McCarrick, in failing to take action, it will be fascinating to see whether the new accountability measures that now exist on paper are actually given some teeth in practice. That certainly is a storyline to keep our eyes on in early 2020. All right, let us shift gears to the mounting controversy surrounding Pence. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is a collection taken all around the Catholic world every year that is intended to support the works of the Pope. Now, when I first got to Rome, and that is, there's been some water under the bridge since then. We're talking more than 20 years. But in the 90s, when I got here, I sort of made the rounds of all of the different Vatican offices, which at the time took me to the Prefecture for Economic Affairs of the Holy See. That was the office back then that kind of was in charge of the Vatican's checkbook, so to speak, ran the financial operation. And I remember having a conversation with an official in that department about Pence. And that official explained to me that Pence was intended to be a way for Catholics all around the world to directly contribute to the works of the Pope. I mean, and what he meant was that the Pope can do whatever he wants with that money, that the Pope's hands are not tied. If the Pope wants to give it to Caritas, which is the Global Federation of Catholic Charities, he can do that. If he wants to support missionary works in China, he can do that. If he wants to rehab St. Peter's Basilica, he could do that. The idea was, at least as it was presented to me, that this was kind of a general purpose fund upon which the Pope can draw. So, flash forward more than 20 years when the Wall Street Journal reports that only about 10% of Pence goes to charity. To be quite honest with you, I had a hard time at the beginning understanding what the big deal was. However, there is a big deal because it turns out that in marketing campaigns for Pence in many parts of the world, that point is sort of, it's buried in the fine print. And what tends to come across up front is the idea that this is a way to support the charitable works of the Pope. So people, when they give to Pence, often have the impression that they are giving to feed the poor, to house the homeless, and to support all the other well-known charitable initiatives that Pope Francis and his team sponsor. And in reality, of course, the lion's share of their money is not going to those works. And so it has sort of outraged a lot of people. And so I think the fallout is this. One of two things is going to happen. Either the scope of Pence is going to have to be redefined in order to focus it more narrowly on works of charity, or the marketing, the sales pitch, so to speak, for contributing to Pence is going to have to change. And it's going to have to be more transparent about where the money ends up. As, of course, is standard practice for American charities. If you're considering giving to virtually any charity in the United States, 30 seconds on Google can produce an annual financial statement, and you can know precisely where your money is going, because, of course, there are reporting laws and so on. And it may be, as part of the Vatican's ongoing financial reform, they will have to institute something similar for Pence. Frankly, I think if the Vatican were just upfront, that what they are asking you to do is just place a little bit of your money at the Pope's disposal so he can use it for whatever he considers to be his most urgent need at the moment. I don't think that would produce a radical decline in giving. I think most Catholics would be happy to try to support the Pope. The key is they just want to know that their money is being handled responsibly. And what that means, of course, is that if the Vatican wants donations to Pence or anything else to keep rolling in, it's got to make sure that it is serious about this ongoing project of financial reform so that it can provide those kinds of assurances. All right, finally, two big picture news stories that have very much sort of been making headlines all around the world over the last couple of weeks. One involves a politician, Boris Johnson, former mayor of London and head of the UK's Conservative Party. who came into office lacking a parliamentary majority, lost a series of votes in Parliament related to his plan for Brexit, that is, for the UK exiting the European Union. It clamored for a general election. It finally got one. Everyone expected the Conservatives to do reasonably well, but few quite expected the actual result, which was an overwhelming landslide in favor of the Tories, an 80-seat majority in Parliament, in the House of Commons, which means that Johnson and the Conservatives can govern on their own without anyone's help. And that, of course, means that Brexit, at least in some way, shape, or form, it no longer comes with a question mark at the end of the word. It's more like an exclamation point. Brexit is going to happen, and Johnson is likely set to govern the UK for the next 5 years, barring unforeseen calamity. Now, the other figure, global icon, who has very much been in the news, is not a politician, at least not of the conventional sort. It's teenager Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who launched the Fridays for Future campaign, basically asking school students to, instead of going to school on Friday, to stage rallies all around the world demanding action on climate change. And she, of course, has become the global hero of the anti-climate change movement. And Time recently named her its Person of the Year. She is the youngest person ever to be named Person of the Year by Time magazine. Just as a footnote, she is the first Swedish teenager, but there have actually been 3 popes who have been named Time's Person of the Year. John the 23rd was the first, John Paul II was the second, and Francis was the third. Now, so there was a kind of natural kinship, I suppose. Greta is now part of a club to which popes, including this pope, also belong. Now, what is interesting is that, whenever something big happens in the news, whether, it's a war breaks out someplace, or there's a dramatic election someplace, or there's a natural disaster, reporters tend to descend upon the Vatican seeking comment. And it's always interesting to try to gauge when Vatican officials choose to comment on these things and when they decide that discretion is the better part of valor. Now, on Boris, they have clearly made the second choice. You will look in vain for a comment from the Pope, from the Secretary of State, from any senior Vatican official on the English election results. And that's not merely because the Vatican generally, at least in any official capacity, doesn't comment on the electoral politics of a singular nation. That has never stopped individual officials in the past from saying things, even if they're benign, just wishing the winner well, and saying I will be praying for the great nation of the UK or whatever. But in this case, no one has said anything. It's also because, to be quite honest with you, the result, if not embarrassing, isn't at least probably fully what Pope Francis and his team would have wanted. Remember, Pope Francis is the winner of the Charlemagne Prize. That's the top honor bestowed by the EU for his advocacy of greater European integration. Johnson, of course, stands in a sense for disintegration, that is, for taking the UK out. And so, while I don't think at all would be fair to say that the Pope somehow campaigned for the opposition, nevertheless, it's a result with which he and the Vatican no doubt would look on with at least some degree of ambivalence. Meanwhile, when it comes to Greta, the Vatican has been fairly effusive in its praise. Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, who heads the Vatican's dicastery for promoting integral human development, was holding a press conference for the annual message for the World Day of Peace the day after Time made its announcement. And he went on at some length about how pleased he was with this recognition for Greta, and in fact called her a great example of church teaching on the environment, and explicitly connected her campaign to the Pope's eco-encyclical Laudato Si. Now, I think what is interesting about this is the following. Often we measure the political effectiveness of an organization in terms of its impact in what we might call vertical politics. That is, their impact on leaders, their impact on elections, their impact on the top. And so, we colored John Paul a massive political success when he set in motion a series of events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. We colored him a failure when his advocacy against the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq failed to stop that war. In other words, when the Pope got what he wanted in the vertical sense, he won. When he didn't, he lost. However, maybe a better way to look at what popes are about, and this is probably especially true with Francis, is that what they're playing is not the vertical game of politics, they're playing the horizontal game. That is, rather than putting all their eggs in the basket of getting their person in the presidency or prime ministership, or seeing that their party wins, or whatever, seeing that their particular piece of legislation passes. Maybe what they're actually about is shaping civil society, inspiring grassroots figures and movements that aren't directly partisan, but can kind of recalibrate the context in which the partisan political game is played. And in that sense, Greta Thunberg is a classic example of a horizontal figure who is not beholden to any particular political party. She's not part of the traditional political game. But nevertheless, she and the movement that she has inspired are creating the context in which those politicians have to move. And it is having the effect, of course, of driving many of them to be more explicit, more robust in their advocacy of measures to combat climate change. Now, what difference all of that will make in the long run still remains to be seen. Horizontal politics is playing the long game. But of course, if any institution on the face of the earth is expert in playing the long game, it is the Vatican. This is Rome. We think in centuries. The working motto of the Vatican often is, talk to me on Tuesday and I'll get back to you in 200 years. The Vatican is well accustomed to playing the long game. And so in that sense, horizontal politics are a great fit. And it probably is no surprise that when Pope Francis would be combing, his press digest for the last week or so, he was probably more excited, more edified by the praise for Greta than by the landslide for Boris. All right, that is the John Allen Show for this week. Thanks for listening. You can always find full coverage of the Catholic news on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. And, of course, you can find the works of Bishop Robert Barron and the other great resources of the Word on Fire Institute on their site. That is wordonfire.institute. Obviously, we are on the precipice of Christmas, so I want to take this opportunity to wish you and your loved ones the merriest and holiest of holidays. We will see you on the other side. The next time we talk, it will be calendar 2020. We will have a new year in front of us. There will be a great deal to talk about, both in terms of what's happened over the holidays and also what's to come in the early new year. So have a fantastic and blessed holiday. Keep the faith, and we will talk soon.